welcome to the first session for honors thesis presentations. I'm Dr. Seema Shrikhande, Director of the Honors Program, and in this session we have 4 students presenting their theses. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to have all 4 speak and then have time for questions at the end. Our first presenter is Victoria Lindbergh, and her thesis is entitled Parlez-vous, a show about women in the 21st century as told by 5 famous women. Her honors chair is Dr. J. Lutz.
Hi everyone. Like Dr. Shrikhande said, I'm Victoria Lindbergh. And so for my honors thesis, I chose to do something a bit different. And I wrote and performed a one-woman show called #Parlez-vous, which is kind of a play on words. Parlez-vous français is, do you speak French? And so the title was, do you speak woman? And so this show it actually ended up featuring 6 famous French women, because at the end I added Simone de Beauvoir. But it's set in 2018, and I wanted to make it a modern day representation of issues that women have been facing throughout history, but then also to tell it, like, what would these women be doing if they were alive today, and then talk about the issues that they were both, or that they were all experiencing in their own time. So the show starts out with Joan of Arc, who was a warrior during the 100 Years' War in France, and she's a 19-year-old girl, and in this show she's a YouTuber, and so she's criticizing France's Rassemblement National party, which is basically their far-right party, about attributing her face to their brand. And so then the next character was Olympe de Gouges. She was a revolutionary protester during this time. And so she's like a modern day women's rights activist standing outside of a government building protesting. And then the third character was Marie Antoinette, and she was kind of the modern day equivalent of a housewife or celebrity, and she was being interviewed by Vogue. And then the 4th character was Marie Curie, and so she was hosting a PBS telethon, and so she discussed the disparity of women in STEM, as well as this current administration's plans to cut funding for public broadcasting, and she brought up a few issues such as climate change and other relevant scientific discoveries. And then the next to last woman is Coco Chanel. She was probably the most stereotypical French woman. She's sitting outside of a cafe, smoking a cigarette, drinking wine, and she's thinking about the new collection. And so she has 2 conversations during this monologue, where the first is with the current creative director, Karl Lagerfeld. So she's discussing how she hates what fashion has become. And then the second conversation is with none other than Donald Trump. And oddly enough, she discusses the dressing, like making a dress for Melania for some event. And if you saw the news yesterday, apparently they had their recent state dinner, and Melania was wearing all Chanel. So predicted that one. And then finally, I thought that the show wasn't complete without including Simone de Beauvoir, who was kind of my inspiration for this. And so I wrote this kind of shorter monologue where I completely changed her personality and turned her into this Broadway-style diva who was complaining about not being included in the show. And she kind of summed up the themes of my entire show, and that we're all coming at life from different perspectives, but it's really important to listen to other people and what they have to say. And so that's basically my show. I guess I'll talk a little bit about how I decided to do this project. So I'm a double major in French and theater, and I wanted to do something that tied the 2 together. And I discussed, writing maybe about Molière or something like that. But then I read this article about SNL star Kate McKinnon and the honors thesis that she did when she was in college. It was a one-woman show, and I was like, that's really cool. And then Professor Handler told me about another woman, Anna DeVere Smith, who also does one-woman shows. Her shows are fabulous. I watched her TED Talk for American Characters, And then I was like, this is what I have to do. And so that was kind of the writing process. And so now I will perform one of the characters from my show. I'm doing Marie Antoinette. So. You know, I don't typically give interviews anymore, but when you called about this new feature in Vogue, I thought it might be nice to share my side of the story. It's just, I don't want to be misrepresented. There's been a lot said about me, and do you ever have those people where every time you run into them, you always say the wrong thing and do the wrong thing and just make a complete fool out of yourself? Well, turns out I do that quite a lot. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm not the monster everyone thinks I am. France was broke when I got here. Why should I be blamed for destroying a country simply for adapting to the life of my predecessors? I mean, I like nice things, don't get me wrong. Certain standards must be maintained, but everyone acts like I was the most extravagant one in Versailles. Have you seen the Comte d'Artois, Louis's brother? He ordered 365 pairs of shoes a year. Yet somehow, my 200 pairs is what sent the country into ruin. Double standard much? I guess sometimes I feel guilty. I could have used a little bit less flour in my hair or reworn my clothes and shoes a few more times, but those things seem necessary at the time. If only Run the Runaway were still a thing back in those days, imagine the money I could have saved. Although, online shopping is my greatest downfall these days. Thanks to the internet, now I can buy anything I want at 3 a.m. Why, yes, I do need that hedgehog pot holder and matching tea towel. Vintage Chanel? Hello. And don't even get me started about Net-a-Porter. Yikes. Sorry, where was I? Got a little distracted. But I guess I could be a bit excessive. I mean, when I had them build that hamlet in the forest for me, that was a bit much. Although, actually, no. I needed that. I just had to get away. Wouldn't you if everyone was always criticizing you for every minuscule thing you said and did? Everyone hated me in those days. But I did nice things. I brought awareness to the arts. I dressed down in simpler clothes. I took in homeless children. I was less involved in politics. But it didn't matter. They always found something else to criticize. If it wasn't my appearance or my social life, it was what I said or didn't say. Say something and it's the wrong thing to say. Don't say anything and you're too selfish to care about others. I guess now I know how Hillary Clinton feels. You know, I could handle the things at first, but then they went after my own children. They made my son lie about me. And at that point, I hit rock bottom, and you know, I'm more than this caricature or this fabricated quote in a magazine. I never even said let them eat cake, yet that's the only thing I'm known for. But I'm doing better now. I took some time off and worked on some things, and I kind of feel like a person again, which is good, I guess. But at the end of the day, it'll never change the fact that I'll always remember what people said about me and the way they treated me. I may be royalty, but I'm just a person, and I want to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. So, I guess that's everything. Thank you so much. I almost forgot. Would you like a piece of cake, darling? I had my staff make it this morning. It's to die So I read about it in this magazine, and apparently gluten is slowly killing us all. So I'm trying this new thing. Sure does save a lot of flour, huh? So I guess since we're waiting for questions at the end, that's what you're doing.
So our second presenter is McSwain. His thesis is titled A Self-Propelling-Wheel, Prefigured Recurrence in Nietzsche's The Birth of Tragedy, and his honors chair is Dr. Printz Whooley.
All right, hello. I will be talking to you today about the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, as the title suggests, and in particular his ideas about eternal recurrence and how that is prefigured and how we can read that in his earlier views on art in The Birth of Tragedy. So just to start, if you don't know who Friedrich Nietzsche is, here he is, great mustache. He's a 19th century German philosopher, most notable for his works in science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, just to name a few. And also for his ideas about the Übermensch, which is notoriously translated as the Superman if you're a bad translator, or the Overman if you're a good translator. The slave of mass morality, will of power, and of course eternal recurrence, which we'll be talking about today. He's also kind of infamously known for how he was misappropriated historically by the early 20th century kind of fascist movements, frankly, and how he's kind of just like lumped together with nihilism and how he's construed as a nihilist, somehow like denying philosophers. So a little bit of the work I'll be doing today will be to show how he's actually a deeply life-affirming philosopher, how through eternal recurrence in particular, we begin to cultivate an attitude that does indeed affirm life, enable us to reconcile ourselves with the facts of our life and create in light of those facts. So if you don't know what eternal recurrence is, here's the original aphorism, or brief excerpt of the original aphorism from The Gay Science. And, right, so it says, with the greatest weight, this life as you now live it, have lived it, you'll have to live once more, innumerable times more, so on and so forth, right? It has something to do with the repetition of time, the repetition of the exact contents of one's life, this idea that you will have to do exactly what you have been doing eternally. And with this, we can already kind of tease out some of the greater implications here. The weight of the action, the weight of the moment, and the weight of the values you are choosing to live by. Right? But kind of what motivated my research was not that particular aphorism, but something he says way later on in his career, toward the end of his career, in The Twilight of the Idols, where he directly identifies eternal recurrence with Dionysus. Now, this is unique, kind of first and foremost, because he invites this text, The Birth of Tragedy, which is his first text, his first philosophical work. It's also the most sustained meditation on Dionysian philosophy. But it does not directly say anything about eternal recurrence, right? So this is kind of odd, this is unique in a sense. Also, this is the first time in his work that he is inviting us to consider eternal recurrence as somehow related to Dionysus. However, after doing just kind of a cursory view of the literature, no one really tries to articulate how the term recurrence is related to Dionysus, and no one really invites a reading of the birth of tragedy into the conversation about eternal recurrence. So, kind of my claim here is, yes, there's a connection between eternal recurrence and Dionysian aesthetics. And yes, we can bring the birth of the tragedy into sort of reanalysis of eternal recurrence. And ultimately, I think the birth of tragedy prefigures and motivates the creation of the doctrine of eternal recurrence, and also provides us with the sort of attitude we will have if we take eternal recurrence seriously. Now just bring it back to the original text, to the birth of tragedy. We're looking at the centrality of the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which are associated with their namesake gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Nietzsche claims that these are the central movers of art, the primary aesthetic movers, so to speak. And the Apollonian is going to be associated with the dream realm, which is, for Nietzsche, eventually going to just boil down to shapes, forms, beautiful things, that which is most immediately intelligible to us in art. However, the Dionysian is going to be associated with kind of the exact opposite tendency, intoxication, rapture, a sort of new unity formed out of the disillusionment of all things, right? And ultimately, for Nietzsche, kind of the upshot of the Dionysian is unintelligibility, as opposed to the intelligibility of the Apollonian. Right? And Nietzsche finds these two art impulses have their highest expression in tragic art, in original Greek tragic art, in that they condition us to the tragic will, and they move us closer to the suffering of life as we become attuned to the tragic awareness as it's presented onto the stage. And through that, somehow we can be reconciled with suffering, and we can then create something in light of that suffering, along with the tragic hero as he stands central to the stage. That's better. There we go. However, also in the birth of tragedy, he's going to isolate a decline of this art, right? And this is kind of prefiguring his bigger historical method, right, where he just thinks we're all in a state of decline in a certain sense, right, or at least historically. He sees the decline in Greek tragic art as coming from the formal innovations of Euripides, which is just going to be kind of a low-key form of Socratic philosophy. And so with Euripides, Nietzsche claims that there's a cultivation of a spectator state, in that it's no longer about the tragic hero standing center stage, it's now about everyone. The everyman is up there on the stage. There's no presence of that kind of supreme suffering that we're becoming acquainted with. And really this just kind of solidifies the status of the audience as viewing something, as not engaging with the aesthetics of the stage, but rather being firmly removed from it and removed from the act of reconciliation and creativity. And of course, he's going to equate this with Socratic philosophy, this sort of denigration of the unintelligible and the veneration of intelligibility, the focus on rationality, the focus on ultimately denigrating the things of this life in order to attune ourselves to something bigger, something else, right? And really, this is kind of a slippery slope for Nietzsche in that he's just going to equate Socratic philosophy with Platonism and the otherworldliness of Platonism when you have the Platonic heaven of the forms. And of course this, this prefigures his critique of Christianity, insofar as it too kind of moves us away from dealing with the facts of this world and focusing on the other world, changing the conversation from the suffering of this life and putting it in the conversation of suffering aimed at something else, right? And so you can see this kind of causal chain here, and of course we can invite the death of God into this conversation. I don't want to harp on that too much, because I think, right, people read a lot into that. But really his point there is, look, for whatever reason, we're not actually dealing with the things of this world anymore. And this is the result of a really bad move of Western philosophy. And for Nietzsche, as close as we get to kind of anything like progress is going to be in the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, who's just a downright pessimist, right? He's going to say something like, look, to get over the problem of suffering, we just need to reject desires or something like that. However, that's not enough for Nietzsche, because that's ultimately that same sort of inactivity, that same sort of failure to engage with suffering that he finds in the Socratic, the Platonic, and the Christian modes. And so really, what I want to highlight here is that Nietzsche is posing the doctrine of eternal recurrence to move us into a state of activity, to deal with the problem of pessimism, in order to kind of revise the last 2,000 years of philosophy, which so far has either tried to evade the question of suffering or just reject it altogether, as Schopenhauer does, and move us again into activity, hopefully into that reconciliatory and that creative state that kind of vitalized the Greeks. And so my reading of eternal recurrence is based around the sort of metaphorical application of the weight of eternity in distinct stages of recurrence. Now this is kind of distinct from other readings that people have done of Nietzsche, where they go so far as trying to claim that he literally believes that time repeats itself eternally. I don't really buy into that too much for reasons we could get into in the Q&A. But I think we should consider eternal recurrence as if it were true. And in doing so, we apply this metaphorical weight of eternity to each and every moment in our life, to each and every action. And through that, that allows us to see what values we are assenting to and how we feel about those values. Would we actually want to live like this eternally? We should do this in 3 distinct stages of recurrence that reflect our temporal relation to the material of our life, our past, our present, our future. Luckily, Nietzsche provides kind of the analog for this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra and the 3 stages of metamorphosis. And he gives us this great metaphor of the camel, the lion, and the child, where the camel is just the stage where you kind of where you realize the burden of your existence, the burden of your actions, all the moments of your life. You can then begin an antagonistic relationship with that material as you kind of pick and choose what you actually would want to repeat eternally. And then finally, you move onward to this stage of the child, where you can begin value creation, you can begin to choose a new life. And once you reach that stage, you adopt an attitude of Dionysian pessimism, which, mind you, is still a deeply pessimistic view, hence the name Dionysian pessimism. The prerequisite for this is suffering. In that total consideration of your life, you have to get to a state where you have to fathom the idea that you could suffer eternally, and then base your actions, your values, your attitudes about life in light of that. And ideally, this is going to leave us in a state of activity, again, versus inactivity, where we realize our ontological ability to change our lives. And in doing so, this is the same sort of attitude that we saw in the Dionysian aesthetic impulse of Greek tragic art, namely a reconciliation with suffering and a creativity in the light of that suffering. And so ultimately, just to kind of bring it all the way back around, in The Birth of Tragedy, I see a prefiguration, a motivation of the conditions that give rise to eternal recurrence as something that's going to allow us to address the question of suffering and move into a state of activity. And through that activity, luckily, The Birth of Tragedy provides us with the aesthetics of that attitude, a Dionysian attitude. And yeah, that's all I got.
The next student presenting is Meredith Myers. Her thesis is entitled, "But This Is Where All the Trouble Starts," with words, self-determining characters and the struggle for narrative authority. Her honors chair is Dr. Sarah Terry.
My research idea was born out of rehearsal for Oglethorpe's production of Hair the Musical last year. During the process, we ran into some difficulties, unfortunately having to replace a lead actor last minute due to injury. As we neared the show, I was surprised by how deeply these logistical hiccups were affecting my creative process. And I found that my character suddenly felt wild and unpredictable in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I kept a journal throughout the process, and one entry in particular was the seed of an idea. This is the first time I've ever felt a character as such a real person that I'm often afraid I cannot control her. I don't know if that's good or bad. I've been told that acting is being, but also that acting is about making choices, which implies a level of control over being. Is a character something I create, or do I allow it to create itself through me? Am I the craftsman or the vessel? Can I be both? I began to notice similar questions in the theory of my English and theater classes. Who controls a narrative? Does the author hold authority as they guide the minds of their audience, or rather does the interpreter, the actor, or the reader exercise authority over the author by taking the ideas presented in the author's work and building their own interpretation as to its meaning? With these questions in mind, I chose to examine the 1921 play by Luigi Pirandello and 6 Characters in Search of an Author, and the 1939 novel At Swim Two Birds by Flann O'Brien. Both of these works are considered meta, meaning that they break the fourth wall, or subvert convention in order to call attention to their own construction or artificiality. Specifically, both the play and the novel are meta because they employ characters with an unconventional awareness of their use as literary devices. This awareness leads to discomfort with their own lack of autonomy. Initially, I set out to demonstrate similarities between the play and the novel, recognizing that they both use their metatextuality to pose similar questions about narrative authority. However, as I began to research these texts further, I came to the conclusion that while they are asking similar questions, they ultimately provide opposing answers to these questions. And thus, my thesis became, both 6 Characters and At Swim use their metatextuality to take a firm stance regarding how narrative authority should operate between author and interpreter. However, whereas 6 Characters uses its metatextuality to elevate the hierarchical superiority of the author, At Swim's metatextuality rebels against the tyranny of an all-powerful author and champions the freedom of the interpreter. Specifically, Pirandello's metatheater responds to the question of narrative authority through self-aware characters, each competing to act as a primary interpreter for their story. The play is about a family of self-aware characters who intrude upon a rehearsal for another Pirandello play, The Rules of the Game. Essentially, the metatheater takes the form of a Pirandello play about a group of characters who take over another Pirandello play. Led by a controlling father and an outspoken stepdaughter, fighting for control of the narrative, the 6 Characters in Search of an Author describe how they have been abandoned by their author and are looking for someone to help them finish their telling their story. Each of the characters has a different perspective on the events of their story and each is contending that theirs is the authoritative account. A fierce debate between the characters ensues, and Pirandello explores the competition of many interpreters vying for control over the storytelling process. The father demonstrates this pervasive anxiety about the variety of interpretations, saying, "But this is where all the trouble starts, with words. We all have a world of things inside of us. Everyone has his own world of things. And how can we understand each other if in my words I put the meaning and the value of the things inside of me, while my listener inevitably receives them with all the meaning and the value that they have for him in his own inner world? We think we understand each other, we never understand each other." Indeed, just as Pirandello's play capitalizes on this anxiety about misinterpretation and misunderstandings, his theory regarding theater as an art form expresses many of the same fears as his characters. His qualms about theater as an artistic medium are revealed in his 1908 essay entitled Illustrators, Actors, and Translators. He writes, "Unfortunately, there always has to be an unavoidable element that intrudes between the dramatic author and his creation and the material being of the performance, the actor. As it is well known, this is an unavoidable limitation for the dramatic art. Just as the author has to merge with his character in order to make it live, to the point of feeling as it feels, desiring as it desires, so also, and to no lesser degree, if that can be accomplished, must the actor." Pirandello's classification of the actor as an unavoidable limitation for the dramatic art firmly establishes his discomfort, which often borders on disdain, with the interpretive work of the actor. His doubts are evident in his wondering if the actor merging with the character can be accomplished at all. By characterizing the actor's profession as an intrusion between the dramatic author and his creation, Pirandello classifies the actor as an imposing foreigner entering the world of the play. an alien who appropriates the author's creation by necessity rather than by right. Pirandello distrusts the theatrical form's reliance on a creative middleman, or a translator from the page to the stage. Ultimately, his concern lies in the conversion of the author's sacred original intent into a multitude of interpretations or misinterpretations. The father character, too, articulates his concern about the inauthenticity about being played by an actor. He says, "Look, I think that however hard this gentleman tries to identify with me for all his art and goodwill, he'll be hard put to represent me as I really am. It will be more like his interpretation of what I am, how he feels me, if he feels me, and not the way I feel myself deep down." Here, the father asserts the inability of the actor to ever truly express a character exactly as the playwright intended. Reflecting upon the creative divide between the author and the playwright, critic Seth Baumrin argues, Pirandello appears in 6 characters to have perceived the actor's autonomy as a threat to authorship. It is the autonomy of the character, not the actor, that is the point of 6 characters in search of an author. Ultimately, Pirandello implements his meta-theater to imagine a world where theatrical characters do not require actors, empowering these characters to speak for themselves, independent of any actor negotiating the playwright's words into performance. Therefore, Pirandello elevates the sanctity of the author's conception over any alternative interpretations. Whereas Pirandello writes characters that declare the authority of the author over the interpreter, the 1939 novel At Swim, Two Birds ultimately rejects the politics of writing as a means of establishing order. Contrary to Pirandello's ideal of the author's superiority, O'Brien uses the absurdism of his metafiction to celebrate disorder, confusion, and the potential for a variety of interpretations. The metafiction of At Swim works as follows. Brian O'Nolan, the real person, he creates a pseudonym that he writes under, Flann O'Brien, under which he writes a novel of the unnamed student narrator, who writes a novel about Dermot Trellis, who writes a novel about John Fursky. It's a novel within a novel within a novel. Early in the book, the student narrator provides a detailed account of a spontaneous and unsolicited literary manifesto that he delivers to his friends at a pub. Here, the narrator insists that the novel in the hands of the unscrupulous writer could be despotic. The satisfactory novel should be a self-evident sham to which the reader could regulate at will the degree of his credulity. By empowering the reader to regulate at will their beliefs regarding a text, the narrator specifically encourages the reader to exercise their own individual interpretation, a perspective that directly opposes Pirandello's belief that there is one true reading of a work created by the author that could be tainted by subsequent interpretations. Additionally, the narrator holds that combating the despotic novel can be done through the author's treatment of his characters. He professes, it was undemocratic to compel characters to be uniformly good or bad or poor or rich. Each should be allowed a private life, self-determination, and a decent standard of living. Indeed, the freedoms of a private life, self-determination, and a decent standard of living are precisely the opposite of how tyrannical author Trellis treats his characters within the narrator's manuscript. Trellis is characterized by his absolute control over his minions. He is described as a moralist whose novel is an effort to institute a moral ordering of society. Essentially, he hopes to use his authorship as a tool for controlling the behavior of both his characters and his audience. Critic Todd A. Comer reinforces O'Brien's condemnation of authorial tyranny by linking Trellis's oppressive control of his characters to the influence of colonialism in Ireland in the early 20th century. Because Trellis's art depends upon the restriction of free will, Comer identifies Trellis as a colonizer intent on constructing Ireland to serve his own political agenda. Thus, through the character of Trellis, O'Brien investigates the consequences, political and otherwise, of using writing to impose order. Ultimately, one of the most repressive ways Trellis controls his characters is by forcing identity upon them. For example, John Fursky, born a character at the mercy of Trellis, is assigned to play the villain of Trellis's story. However, Fursky's true personality never aligns with the depraved character that he's instructed to play. By prescribing an inauthentic identity, Trellis uses the act of writing to establish authoritarian order that colonizes the selfhood of his characters. In condemning the fictional author who invades the minds of others, O'Brien condemns authors that seek to control the interpretation of their readers as distinctly authoritarian. By depicting an author, Trellis, who abuses the power that writing affords him, and depicting another author, the narrator, who is aware of this dangerous power, O'Brien uses the metafictional narrative layers of At Swim to examine the potential for writing to enforce oppressive totalitarian order. Additionally, he examines the potential for writing to expose and dismantle such regimes. Ultimately, O'Brien exposes the tyrannical tendencies of a hierarchy that positions the author above all and embraces the chaos of a distinctly amoral absurdism. His metafiction responds to the question of narrative authority by rebelling against the all-powerful author and championing the freedom of the interpreter. Ultimately, both Pirandello and O'Brien engage in this theoretical quest for authority in narrative by employing metatextual self-awareness in their characters to argue for either the authority of the author or the interpreter. Pirandello uses self-aware characters who resist being interpreted by others to elevate the authority of the author over the interpreter. His metatheater provides a thorough denunciation of theater as a genre because it relies on many layers of collaborative interpretation. Contrastingly, O'Brien's metatextuality serves to do the opposite, unraveling authorial power through self-determining characters who rebel against their author's authority. The absurdism of his metafiction deconstructs the idea of a universal superior reading in favor of a multitude of interpretations. Because both Pirandello and O'Brien use their metatheater and metafiction to champion opposing sides in the debate for narrative authority, these examples demonstrate the power of metatext to examine the relationship between author and interpreter.
Thank you, Meredith. Our next and final presenter is Sarah Rodgers. Her thesis is titled Hamilton and the American Promise. Her honors chair is Dr. Reshmi Hebbar.
Hi. As Dr. Shrikhande said, my name is Sarah. For those of you who don't know, Hamilton is a 2015 musical that was created by the Tony-winning writer Lin-Manuel Miranda. It's based on Ron Chernow's 800-page biography. It was narrated by Aaron Burr, who ultimately kills Hamilton, ironically. He's super charming in the musical, and he has a very nice velvety voice, and it kind of drives the whole plot. This musical is notable because it uses exclusively people of color and with different multicultural backgrounds. It has a few white people, but typically George Washington is a bald, strapping black man. Philippa Sue, who plays Hamilton's wife, Eliza, is from an Asian background. It's very multicultural. This thesis was constructed from a contemporary literature class that I took during my junior year. Initially, I wanted to explore the relationship between art and history using Hamilton as a case study, and eventually this expanded into a project about the relationship between Hamilton and the American dream, and what it says about the American dream. So if it supports it, if it denies it, what it says about it exactly. So this question developed because, as I point out in my thesis, from the very beginning of the musical, there's the narrative of improvement. So for those of you who haven't heard of it, this is the very first song. Okay, How does a bastard orphan, son of war, and a Scotsman, dropped in the middle of a forgotten spot in the Caribbean by Providence, grow up to be a hero and scholar, basically? So you know from the very beginning of the musical that this is going to be the story of somebody who lifts themselves up from their bootstraps. Okay? And after research and analysis, I found that Hamilton's tone is centered around the American dream, but it ultimately does not support the American dream. It does, but it also recognizes that it has not been inclusive to every walk of life in America as it promises. So this promise strives to fulfill what the American dream historically has not. It draws immigrants and people of color into the narrative. And it argues for equality by utilizing American history, rap, hip hop, and multicultural casting. So in order to understand what the American promise is, you have to understand what the American dream is. The term was coined in 1931, and it basically talks about how people of all walks of life ought to be able to improve their innate abilities in order to succeed. And it emphasizes like becoming better as a person versus becoming better financially. There is also the portrayal of becoming better financially inside of later incarnations, and that's the one that we know now. But that was the initial idea. So it's not just like Hamilton is not just an American dream story, it's an American promise story. Hamilton embodies a bootstrapper who comes up from the bottom, but he also embodies the actor who plays him, he was Lin-Manuel Miranda, also the creator, is Hispanic, from Hispanic immigrants, his parents. He has a slave in his ancestry. He raps, he speaks in slang and hip hop lyrics and things like that. So he basically combines a bunch of different elements. And the fact that he succeeds shows that people of all walks of life ought to be able to achieve the American dream. The American promise also harkens back to two specific incidences inside American history. The first is Lyndon B. Johnson's 1965 speech during the Civil Rights era. He gave it, and he says, "To deny a man his hopes because of his color or race or religion or the place of his birth is not only to do injustice, it is to deny Americans and to dishonor the dead who gave their lives for American freedom." So he skips over and says, "It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause, and we shall overcome." The other time that the American promise is used is during Barack Obama's 2015 speech after he was nominated for the Democratic Party's presidency. He defines the American promise as the idea that we are responsible for ourselves, but we also rise and fall as one nation. He also adds that the government should ensure opportunities not for those who with the most money and influence, but for every American who's willing to work. Thus, I conclude that Hamilton believes that the American dream is possible, but historically has not been accessible to everyone. And the double meaning of the promise comes into play here. The promise is both the assurance that something will happen and America's potential for greatness. And part of the way that he constructs his narrative, as I mentioned before, is through the use of rap and hip hop. So Hamilton has a lot of parallels between Tupac, Nas, Biggie, people who came up from the bottom. He grew up in the hood on the Caribbean. He was surrounded by violence. And hard work is also strongly emphasized in the musical as well, which ties into immigrant narratives. Because typically, especially with conversations about DACA and who's allowed to be inside of the country, you hear these immigrants contribute a whole bunch to the labor force. In reflecting this, Hamilton is constantly working in the musical. So by combining these elements with the identity of a founding father, Miranda is not only expanding what it means to be American, but actively associating minorities and immigrants with the foundations of the countries. He's not the first to do this. James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and Ta-Nehisi Coates have all tried to wrestle with what it means to be a minority and what it means to be in a country that believes in the American dream. But there is a problem with the way that Miranda does it. He uses old white men who owned slaves in most cases. Even Thomas Jefferson, who's frequently cited as the guy who says that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be accessible to all. He definitely owned slaves. And Ishmael Reed is a main critic of the musical for this. But I don't know if it's because he was focused on the slavery issue or what. He doesn't hone in on one of the innate contradictions of the musical. So Hamilton himself, who is mainly used as an argument for inclusivity when it comes to immigrants, had moments when he was xenophobic. One of these moments was after he dealt with the culprits of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1791. He says to another immigrant who was one of the criminals, he says that basically foreigners are not to be trusted. He also supported the Alien Immigration Acts because he now wants to control the flow of immigration. And finally, he said later on in his life that the influx of foreigners would change and corrupt the national spirit. And also, furthermore, he was not as proud of his immigrant status as he is inside of the musical. He says, men are generally too much attached to their native countries to leave it and dissolve all of their connections. And he does this, he practices what he preaches, to the point where he seemingly forgets that he himself is an immigrant and denounces immigrants later on. Historians also fear that the musical prevents people from having a nuanced understanding of history. But while there are issues with Hamilton, there is one thing that the musical does not do. It does not support the idea that America is currently a country where everybody can achieve the American dream. With close reading, Miranda's portrayal of America as a place where even immigrants can leave their fingerprints and rise up becomes an ideal rather than a reality. To reinforce this message, there is the Hamilton mixtape, which features a remix of the musical songs. Okay, so My Shot, if anybody's familiar with the musical itself, is remixed by The Roots and other rappers. In this song, Black Thought raps, "When even role models tell us we're born to be felons, we're never getting into Harvard or Carnegie Mellon, and we're gonna end up robbing somebody or killing. It's not fair that that's all they can tell us." There's also another song inside of the Hamilton mixtape called "Immigrants, We Get the Job Done" that expresses a disillusionment with the American dream. And one of the rappers raps, "Peter Piper claimed he picked them, he just underpaid Pablo, but there ain't a paper trail when you're living in the shadows." The repetition of "Look how far I've come" and "Immigrants, We Get the Job Done" mocks Americans' ideal that we have achieved progress when it comes to equality. It also reveals that Miranda has no scruples with admitting that the American promise has yet to be realized, and that we have a long way before we can achieve it. If we do, though, the promise argues that we can have immigrants like Hamilton who leave a powerful legacy for not only their children, but their country.
I want to thank all the students for doing such an excellent job of distilling work that they have spent almost 3 semesters on. They started on these projects in their junior year. Their theses are long, so distilling it down to 15 minutes is challenging, but they've all done a great job, and what that does is leaves us time for a lot of questions. So I'm going to invite them up here and sort of take your questions.
I think I have a question for the whole panel. It springs from Meredith's introduction, and it just made me sort of think about everybody's project. So Meredith, you began your presentation by talking about how your research question was spurred by a kind of real-world problem that you were dealing with, of a character potentially that you were acting somehow having some kind of independence from you. And I'm wondering if at the end of your research, if you gained any insight into that real world problem that you were dealing with. And so like that leads me to ask the other people on the panel whether, I guess like a similar kind of question, which is like, did this long research project that you have been engaged in, has it affected your perception of the world outside of the kind of limited research question that you were focused on?
Well, I think that I did start out with this problem, and that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought about bringing it around full circle, but I definitely think that exploring the work of authors who have also grappled with this problem and kind of seeing the variety of perspectives, I think that I kind of came to the conclusion that there's some compromise between the two that has to be reached, and that the two extremes are not necessarily productive. But I would be interested to explore that further as far as how it pertains to me individually. Thank you.
So, in terms of real-world problems, I was writing a thesis during the election and post-election, and during all of these discussions about who should be allowed inside of this country, who should be allowed to stay inside of this country. So there was definitely a huge impact there.
So I wrote most of my thesis actually while I was studying in France this past semester, and a lot of the issues that came up were things that I noticed not only here in America, but also that were happening globally. And so in seeing that these were worldwide problems and not just problems with, any one country or even any one individual, then I wanted to represent that in my show.
Yeah, and I guess for me, the bigger outreach of this project was, well, just maybe kind of think about my values and like how I felt about suffering, right? And if not anything, just big deal. I still think Nietzsche's deeply edgy, like at the end of the day, so that didn't change. But yeah, I guess it made me stop and realize that kind of one of my, moves I can make as like philosophy major, ideally philosophically informed, is I should be able to assess my life and hopefully get to the state where, like Roka says, I must change my life or something like that. So, yeah.
Well, I have a question for Victoria. I was curious about how you went about choosing the women. I'm sure there were many that you had to select from, and how did you narrow it down to the 6 that you included?
So that's a really good question. I started out with a list of probably 20 or 25 women, a lot of them lesser known, but then I decided that for the purposes of this show that I wanted to try to include ones that both my French audience and my American audience would recognize, even if they didn't know their contributions, they would at least know, oh, I've heard of Coco Chanel, or I've heard of Marie Antoinette. And so then I started narrowing it down from there, and actually, I wanted to address a question that I got from the provost at my actual show. He asked why I included 2 women who were not French-born, and that's Marie Antoinette, who was from Austria, and then Marie Curie, who was born in Poland. And I chose to include those 2 women specifically because although they were born in a different country, their contributions were seen much more in France. Marie Antoinette was the Queen of France, and a huge part of the French Revolution. And then Marie Curie there's the Curie Institute in France, which is a leading scientific place. So I wanted to make the show accessible, but then still pay homage to all of these amazing women.
I want to ask you the same question.
Thank you.
So this is a question for Sarah and Meredith. So I saw some symmetry in what you were both saying. So if Alexander Hamilton came back and saw the show, right, is it fair? Would he like it? Is this okay to do this to Hamilton? And I ask because, Hamilton gets some criticism and lots of praise for all kinds of reasons. But they took a lot of license to do this. So just like Meredith was talking about, does she have license as an actor to act the way she feels, or she feels the director wants her to act, or she feels the way the character should behave? How far can Meredith stray from the script and be okay? And for Miranda, so he reads this book, which is, you know, a dense, good history book, 800 pages, and you can learn a lot about Hamilton. And then he sort of, Miranda takes some of this. Some of it's a little unfair. Much of it is fair, and Chernow was consulted on the project.
Yes.
But yet, I'm just wondering how much liberty was taken, and is there ever a point where you could take so much liberty that you go beyond what the author intends?
Okay. So, Chernow, in response to like the criticism from historians and other people, he said he was actually saddened by the criticism because he felt that Hamilton was a great argument for representation in Broadway, and he thought it was something really innovative. But in terms of how Hamilton would feel, I can spitball here. Like I said, he wasn't super proud of his immigrant heritage. He tried to bury it. Anytime people wanted to get like something out of him, they would bring it up. They'll call him a Creole bastard in papers and things like that. So in terms of using like his identity as an immigrant to further arguments about things like DACA and things like that, I'm pretty sure it'd be mixed. But at the same time, after he died, his political enemies tried to kind of bury his legacy, and his wife and his sons would write like biographies and things like that to try and make him better known inside of the public consciousness. So at the same time, the musical has kept him from being booted off the $10 bill, and a whole lot more people know about him than they would if the musical hadn't been created. So I think that's kind of a mixed bag right there.
I have a question for Jared and McSwain. So why shouldn't, or why don't you, as other interpreters, view eternal recurrence as a real thing, as something that exists in reality? I guess we could view Christianity as a bit of a distraction from suffering, but if we were to view eternal recurrence as a real thing, perhaps we'll become more focused on that and on that subject. So why don't we view eternal recurrence
Yeah. So I guess just first off, I personally don't read it that way because of the original presentation. It starts off as a sublime what if, but also just kind of any cursory survey of the literature will kind of show you that no one has really tried to swing the argument that time repeats itself eternally through Nietzsche since like the 1950s. Like Arthur Dantos, this really fantastic Nietzsche scholar, just kind of drove that into the ground. It showed that no matter how you worked it out, no matter how serious you took it, it just ended either in contradiction or just like really bad science. So I kind of followed that line and looked at maybe more contemporary reviews of what Dantos' critiques were for that, and just once the dust settled, I didn't think it was a coherent position to hold. Whether or not it's a valuable position to hold is a good question, and we'll get back to you on that. So, yeah.
So I have a question, and specifically this is for Sarah, but also for both Victoria and Meredith. Sarah, I'm going to direct a question to you first. What about Hamilton as a piece of theater drew you to want to explore more about that? Write a thesis.
That's a good question. Les Mis was like my bread and butter for a while. And when Dr. Terry, she actually assigned the Pulitzer Prize winning book and so we had to listen to every single song. Like that was a class assignment. It's like this thick. I was like, Jesus. So when I first started listening to it, though, the fact that it was using rap and hip hop and it has allusions to like biggie, like direct lyrical allusions. And I could play it inside of my house and have my siblings be like, what is this? Like, I just thought that was very good. And I've always questioned the American dream. And like I said, there's direct allusions to that as well inside of the musical, so I just put two of my interests together.
So then my question for Meredith and Victoria would be, and I know you both are teammates, right? So, what drew you specifically to make those leaps into Meredith for you was the leap between the literature and what you're experiencing on stage specifically. And then Victoria, you wrote your entire whole show, right? Why? What brought you to this?
For me, it was take kind of all the classes I was taking at the same time. All the questions I was grappling with seemed to kind of find common ground in a way that I wouldn't have expected. I'd always kind of kept my two majors, English and theater, separate, and it seemed like they were all asking the same question of, you know, how do we interpret, how do we make meaning, and so finding that common ground and then trying to explore that and flesh it out was for me where I got my inspiration.
So for me, I really enjoy sketch comedy and characters, and even like in novels, I'm always interested in how the characters interact with one another and their own personal journeys. And so I liked the idea of doing a one-person show because you can almost instantly switch from like two very different people and portray them in a different way. And so that was kind of my basis. I knew I wanted to do that kind of character work. But then the French aspect honestly just came because I'm a French major, and I was like, how do I turn this into a show that's also relevant to French? And so then I came up with Famous French Woman, but definitely it was a character thing for me.
I think Devin had a question.
So my question is for Jared. Since the teaching project is to revalue all values, and I feel I'll have a follow-up on this. Why should we say yes to an eternity of suffering?
So I think we talked about this in the thesis a little bit, or the defense of it. Look, at the end of the day, why should we respond with activity to suffering rather than inactivity? He does not give us an answer for that. He just kind of develops that pathway. And I guess at the end of the project, I very much so saw it as an elaboration on, again, that initial problem that Schopenhauer was addressing, or trying to think through. So just a different option, if that makes sense. There's no kind of meta argument for that, though. At least he didn't get to it before he died.
I mean, on its face, the idea of accepting an eternity of suffering, it doesn't sound too much different from accepting an eternity of bliss. And in fact, it sounds an awful lot worse.
Well, I guess to speak to that, that was, again, to take kind of the metaphorical application to really get you to figure out how you feel about what you're doing. I guess is kind of ultimate ontological way to put it that way.
Victoria, I only saw the English version of your show. I didn't see the French version. And since you said your inspiration was sketch comedy and all of your characterizations are really grounded more so in a sense of humor than a sense of drama for these characters, I was wondering if you could talk and maybe cite a specific example of how, like, performing one of the humorous moments or the jokes was different in English versus French. You know, did the jokes land in the language differently? Did you have to rethink the syntax in order for that to work? So it's sort of a general question of what was it like to perform in English and in French, and how did you have to adapt for the humor element of it, or did you?
So I will honestly say that the English version of my show went a lot better than the French version, simply just because memorizing like 20 pages of French is a lot. So it was harder for me to, because I was thinking so much about like the French and making sure that it was correct, that it kind of like took away from some of the performance aspects of it. And so I think French people, there were actually about 8 or 9 French women who showed up to the French evening, and I mean, they all complimented me at the end, but it was like crickets in that room. And so like the entire show, whereas during the English version, like there were certain points, certain jokes in each monologue that like I kind of knew were coming. And so it was very interesting to see the 2 different audiences and the way they reacted. I tried to, some of the monologues worked better in terms of the humor, like for Joan of Arc, it actually, the way it was written in English, I was able to keep a lot of it the same for the French version, and I mean, they still didn't really get the humor for the French version, but it definitely, I mean, Dr. Lutz and Dr. Winter Parks both thought it was funny, and so basically, I think French people in general, like, although there are a lot of one-woman shows actually in France, I discovered their humor is just so much different that I think I would have to work a lot longer on this show in order to make it translate to a French audience.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Jared from Dr. Belchers. So I guess this is just sort of a big question, just in sort of general terms about your thesis, which is that it seems like, I mean, one of the things you emphasized is that suffering must be accepted as a premise, right? Prior to any kind of Dionysian pessimism to take root, right? And then we reconcile ourselves with this suffering, begin to create values. What does it mean to reconcile oneself with suffering? I mean, taking it as a premise suggests that you're taking suffering from the get-go as bad, right? It seems like so you have to reconcile with it. But so does that mean that reconciliation is that suffering's not bad, or that you take a neutral stance, or like what is the sort of end goal of a person who starts to engage in Zionism?
I think kind of the ultimate move of reconciliation is to ideally get to that point where you're willing to accept it eternally, right? That's the biggest possible form of reconciliation. Right?
What was the acceptance? Like
the acceptance of it as a fact of life, as something you are going to experience repeatedly. And again, that's going to be a litmus test for your values. Are you okay with that? What are your values worth next to an eternity of suffering? That answer your question?
Yeah.
My question's for Meredith. So you said that you got your inspiration from playing Sheila Franklin in Hair, and that kind of loss of control over the character. What aspects of that character did you find yourself losing control over?
Well, specifically, the Sheila's relationship was so dependent on Berger, and I felt like when we had to switch actors, unfortunately, building a relationship that with a new actor so last minute, I was just having trouble reconciling who she was and who I had interpreted her to be and who she was becoming with a different playing off of somebody else, and that was kind of where I was struggling the most.
This is a question for Meredith. When you were describing Shrikhande as an authorial character, the character who's most concerned with sort of like authorial authority, I guess. Is this a grandfather character you said, or like is it like an older male character, right? Like a father character?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering, is there in that play is there any kind of like underlying either critique or recognition of it being really gendered, the kind of desire for control? And so is there like a sort of stepdaughter character who's rebellious? I was wondering if there's an interplay there that not necessarily undermines your reading, but it has its own kind of internal critique.
Yes, definitely. There's the relationship between the father and the stepdaughter is really interesting. I wish I would have had more time to talk about it. But the stepdaughter also expresses a deep concern with the way that he's telling the story. She feels like he's not being fair to her, and she is also really concerned with the actress who's playing her role. When they come into the rehearsal and they the actors of the theater company decide to take the character's play and perform it, there's this very stereotypical caricature leading lady who's playing the stepdaughter, and the stepdaughter is really uncomfortable with that, and she just like bursts out laughing and can't stop laughing because she feels like it's just so inauthentic, and she says she's nothing like me, and her and the father are mostly, they both are fighting for control, and the stepdaughter is a really interesting character because she's, you know, it's a play from the 20s and she's a really strong female character, but I do think that the desire for control is evident in both of their objectives, and I think that the interplay between them is primarily concerned with where lies the truth. If we both have completely different versions of the story, how do we reconcile these competing narratives?
I think we have time for one last question. Jillian?
Okay. It's actually for Jared. So with the Dionysian pessimism, like accepting and reconciling with suffering, have you ever considered how that plays into today's activism?
Long story short, no. But do you
so
have to
basically, because you were saying that in order to act, in order to engage in something, you need to reconcile and accept the suffering that is around you. So how do you think that motivates, I guess, activism today? And do you think that plays like a greater role in the intensity of the activism?
This would be spitballing at best, because I haven't thought about this at all. That's a great question.
Jared, can you get on the mic?
Yes.
Get on the mic.
Yeah, so this would be spitballing at best. I mean, I think the immediate answer is, look, you have nothing but creative potential, right, with activism, right, or something like that, right? If that is your aesthetic choice to make, I guess, political moves in light of your suffering or something like that, then yeah, you have nothing but the ability to do that, insofar as you're not bumping up against other people's abilities at the same time, right, in their own expressions. Yeah, I'll think about that though. Nietzsche's politics are really, really wild, but that's
Okay.
Well, thank you all so much for coming, and another round of applause.